Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Deacon, for having me again. Thank you to Security in Context and also University of Oklahoma for this opportunity. So my understanding is that Security in Context is about critical research and analysis on issues of peace and conflict. And so today I will tell you about my co-authored book, Women as War Criminals, as a critical approach to how we study women in conflict and post-conflict situations. So my co-author, Jessica Trisco-Darden, and I found a gap in the literature on women in peace and conflict that we sought to contribute to. Mainly, we found that how women as perpetrators, as opposed to victims, are treated after the violence ends has received very little attention in the scholarship. So while how women can contribute to reconciliation efforts and peace talks is studied, how women are held accountable or not held accountable for their actions, often their violent actions, is not studied. So, or definitely not adequately studied. So, and this is largely because this idea of, even the idea of female perpetrators challenges the dominant view of women as victims of conflict. So the topic has largely been avoided. And there is a legitimate concern that emphasizing women's war crimes will draw attention away from the fact that women are indeed more often victims of violence. They commit violent crimes at lower rates than men. And women are a minority of those accused of extreme crimes, such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, etc. But my co-author and I believe that we should be able to look at this issue of women in violence in a more complex manner, to see women as complex political actors, and that in fact failing to do so often means not recognizing women's agency and full capacity in politics, in sort of military, in violence, in all these areas that are often thought of as areas belonging to men. So, and even when violent women are recognized, often their violence is explained through reasons which focus on men, families, or children. So they're sort of considered violent because they followed a violent man in their life, or because they defended their children during a violent conflict, or they're somehow seen as, the few deviant, exceptional women who are not normal or real women. And scholars like Laura Silberg and Karen Gentry have documented this extensively, this sort of explanation of women's violence through men, families, and children. So one recent example that we've seen this in is women who have joined ISIS are often referred to as jihadi brides. By referring to women who join terrorist organizations as brides, this suggests that their intention in becoming terrorists has to do with them finding husbands, rather than because these women believed in the project of the caliphate, or the ISIS or the ISIL project. So rarely do the women's ideological commitments, their political positions, or their strategic choices get considered when we talk about women and violence. So then in this book, we decided to look at 4 different cases of women at different levels in terms of power hierarchy. And the 4 cases are the president, the minister, the soldier, and the student. And what we find in these 4 cases is that the women in our book have ideological commitments. They take sides in the conflicts that they're in, and they're often willing to die for their beliefs. What we also find, because the book focuses on justice after conflict, what we also find is that they are willing to use the gender stereotypes and these ingrained societal biases about women and violence that I just spoke about in their defenses in court. So some of them use such gender defenses willingly, and some are convinced very quickly by their legal teams to do so. And here I'm talking about stereotypes such as that women are going to behave in a more remorseful manner after violence, that they're going to be willing to be more reconciliatory, that they also are more gullible to influence by men involved in the conflict, in particular their superiors or their romantic partners. And that these kinds of defenses are used when these women are put on trial. So, all 4 women that we write about argued in their defenses, and their public defenses as well, in addition to their defenses in court, right, that they were manipulated. So, for example, Biljana Plavšić, who is the case of the president, she argued that she was manipulated by male co-leaders, by the other co-president and other powerful leaders in her country. Pauline Nyiramashuhuko, who is our case of the minister, a woman who was a minister of family and women's development in Rwanda, she argued also that she was manipulated by her superiors. And Lindy England, our case of the soldier, argued that she was manipulated by her boyfriend. And even Hoda Mutana, who is the case of the student who joined ISIS, she argued that she was manipulated by online recruiters. So we see these defenses that rely on sort of relying on the men who made them do it. But we also see defenses that are at the intersection of gender and age, for example, gender and parental status. These are also very common gender defenses used by women who are war criminals and their teams. I think to sort of explain this a bit better and give you a concrete example, I want to tell you a little bit about the case of the president, Biljana Plavšić, because this is the case that inspired this book. It was the first case that I wrote about before we decided to write a book about it. So how this came about is I was actually working on I was not working on gender issues. I was working on an article which looked at high-profile defendants at the tribunal for former Yugoslavia who were on trial for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide for the violence that took place in former Yugoslavia. And I was looking at, in particular, 2 men, Radovan Karadžić and Vojislav Šešelj, and how they defended themselves at the tribunal. And they had this strategy of focusing on delegitimizing the court. In fact, this involved them arguing that the court has no jurisdiction over them, that they sort of took every opportunity they could to ridicule the court. They portrayed themselves as defenders of their nation, as martyrs of the nation, who are sort of being persecuted by a modern day colonial institution, which is how they would refer to the court. And what these men did is they put all of their resources and their defense team towards this project of delegitimizing the International Tribunal. And they used whatever legal or illegal ways they found, such as hacking the email of people who were employed at the tribunal, harassing witnesses, so all sorts of strategies to delegitimize the court. But so while I was working on these cases, I came across the trial transcripts for the only female defendant at the Tribunal for Yugoslavia, and that was Biljana Plavšić. And I found it so interesting that when I looked at her trial transcripts, she surrendered to a warrant. There was no major international search to find her, for example, and her defense team complied with all of the demands of the court, to a point that the defense team was also almost bordering on submission. They continuously repeated that Mrs. Plavšić is complying with the court, that she wishes to cooperate fully, and they repeated this over and over. In fact, reading the transcript is very repetitive in that sense. And I thought that this was so fascinating, as I knew that, the other defendants who were at the same political level and involved in the same conflict, in fact, who she was working with when she was the president of Republika Srpska, had such a different strategy. And I knew that she also had access to the same resources that they did, if she wanted to use them. So sort of this attempt to ridicule the court, to delegitimize the court, to turn the public opinion against the court, right? And I didn't see her do that. So that's sort of what started my fascination with looking at the legal defenses of female perpetrators. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about Biljana Plavšić. Like I said, she is a former president of Republika Srpska, which is one of two constituent parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And she, in fact, helped construct the genocidal racist narrative against the Bosnian Muslims by suggesting that in numerous speeches that she made, by suggesting that Bosnian Muslims were traitors, and that this was something that was passed on through their genes since the Ottoman times, because they had converted willingly or forcefully during the Ottoman Empire. And she made these racist speeches very often, but also, it's important to know that this is a very educated woman, that she was an esteemed botanist. She also led the department, before she became a political leader, that is, she led the Department of Biology at the University of Sarajevo. She also had published extensively and internationally, had won a Fulbright. So this is an educated woman whose views, including her racist views and narratives, would be listened to, right? So she worked alongside Radovan Karadžić, who was the other co-president, and Ratko Mladić, who was the army chief of staff. Now, some of you may know, if any of you follow the proceedings of the Tribunal for Yugoslavia, that both of these individuals, Radovan Karadžić and Ratko Mladić, received life sentences by the Tribunal for Yugoslavia. Ratko Mladić for his military role, and Radovan Karadžić for his political role. So Biljana was indicted on 9 counts at the tribunal, including genocide, including complicity to commit genocide, extermination, deportation, ethnic cleansing. She first pleaded not guilty in 2001, but then very quickly, interestingly, in 2002, agreed to plead guilty to one charge of ethnic cleansing. And the prosecution dropped the remaining charges after she pleaded guilty to that one charge. So during her trial, her defense emphasized that she was excluded from top meetings because she was a woman. So therefore, she didn't have access to very important decisions on the war. They emphasized her age. Continuously in the transcripts, there's reference to her being elderly. There's reference to her health, questions about her health. Also about how pious she is, that she constantly wears a necklace with a cross, sort of her Christian inclinations. At times, there's reference to her preferring to sit in a chapel than attend the court proceedings. So in addition to this kind of defense that was highly gendered, some of the witnesses that were brought on by the defense were international figures, esteemed figures like Madeleine Albright, who confirmed that Biljana Plavšić had a humanitarian character and that she was concerned about the victims of the war. So, to let you know what this led to, what kind of sentence, Biljana Plavšić got 11 years, but ended up serving only 6. So let me just remind you that her co-president is serving a life sentence. Radovan Karadzic, right? Her sentencing judgment contained 15 paragraphs emphasizing the importance of her contribution to reconciliation, emphasizing her remorse, even though she herself did not use these words in her guilty plea. So the political context also here plays a part in the sense that the tribunal at this point did not have a reconciliatory figure to sort of show. So Biljana Plavšić seemed to fit into that as well. How do we know that she wasn't actually remorseful and didn't actually care to reconcile? Well, while she was in prison, she wrote a memoir, a 2-volume memoir in Serbo-Croat, in Cyrillic only. It was not translated into English. It's called Svedočim, which means I testify. So I, of course, read these memoirs carefully and translated parts of them carefully for the article and the chapter that's on her. And in this memoir, Biljana Plavšić rejected her guilt and the reconciliation promoted by the tribunal. She does ridicule the tribunal in the memoir. She also continues to engage in Islamophobic depictions of Bosnian Muslims, especially Bosnian Muslim women. She makes sexist and racist remarks against them in the memoir. Just to remind you, she's writing this memoir while in prison. So we can see that, there's no evidence of this transformed, remorseful, reconciliatory female figure that the court was looking for. So, to conclude her case, she is still well and alive, an elderly lady living in Belgrade. She's been free since 2009. And, this is maybe the most obvious of our cases that we write about in the book, but I thought it would be important to share at least one with you. I'd be happy to talk about the others as well. And I'll leave it at that, and maybe we'll go in the question period.
Thank you. That was fascinating. So while we wait for people to post questions, I was wondering as you were speaking, because I think a lot of these narratives that you're referring to kind of are based on the idea that women's involvement in violence is an aberration, right? That women aren't routinely acting as combatants or as inciters of violence. And would you think that that is true, or are women actually playing a larger role than we give them credit for, as it were. Because I think the assumption is that, okay, women are, they must be lured in by men, or they must be doing it from some other reason, right? Because it's an aberration. Would you think that is accurate, or is it not actually an aberration?
Thank you for that question. So I would argue that, we really have to look at different conflicts and look into the different roles that women play. And different violent groups provide different kinds of opportunities for women. And there are different kinds of gendered narratives that these groups use for their causes, which allow women to participate in certain ways. Sometimes that means more directly, and sometimes that means more indirectly. We definitely see women carrying out the gendered roles that they are given, but we also see women help construct those roles too. And so I want to, this makes me think of a woman who helped construct an extremely gendered approach to a conflict is the case of the minister, Pauline Yaramashuhuko, who she, in fact, encouraged Hutu extremists and genocidaires to rape Tutsi women before killing them. There was this narrative that was used in Rwanda against Tutsi women, where it was suggested that Tutsi women were somehow biologically and sexually different than Hutu women, and that this represented a threat to Hutu women. And so that in order to ensure that Tutsi women do not manipulate the Hutus into subjugation, that this meant that, they should be raped, enslaved, and killed and tortured. So Pauline, as a minister of family and women's development, was actually in a political role that allowed her to, she had a job, a position that allowed her to act against women. And, so we have her ordering these acts, but also there are reports of her driving around in a van, dressed in a military uniform, even though she was not a military personnel, she was a minister, and helping genocidaires finish off the work at these different checkpoints. So, this is, we also have evidence of her participating directly in the action. So that's somebody from a high above kind of role. Now, we have to recognize that most of the time, women who are not in these positions of power are participating in different kinds of things, such as often they're given the role of actually enforcing the extremist and violent ideology and passing it on. So then women become these nurturers of the violent ideology. So, for example, ISIS recently, we've had reports of that with ISIS, where women's role was to train their sons to become so-called cubs of the caliphate, also to recruit members. So they're almost given this educational, nurturing type of role that supports the violence, but also continues the ideology of the group. So that said, we've seen even groups who are very patriarchal, like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, we've seen them at times allow women direct violent roles. Al-Qaeda changed its strategy at some point, where women were allowed to join the police, especially the police that was policing other women and locals in obeying the religious rules and codes by which they were supposed to live, right? So we really have to take this more of a conflict by conflict group by group approach, and not just assume that there will be more either direct or indirect acts of participation. I hope that sort of answers your question.
Absolutely. No, that was exactly. And as you were speaking, I was going to ask more about the role of women in extremist organizations, and you mentioned that with ISIS and the using of women in sort of very gender ways. I don't want to keep asking because we're keeping questions from the audience. So some great questions from the audience. So I'm going to go ahead and pose some of these for you. We have one here that says, I was curious. I truly believe this is an understudied group of perpetrators. Most of the literature I've seen on the topic revolves around women's roles in Nazi concentration camps and death camps. Do you think that this is an overstudied topic? Also, where do you think the biographical study of women in these roles will go moving forward?
That's a really great question, because it is true that a lot, even we start our book and our 4 cases don't have to do with Nazi women, and we are not historians, but this is what the material is on. And I think partly we are willing to accept violent women who maybe have passed away or who are not so threatening anymore, because also we can think about the Nazis as somehow an exceptional event in history where even women behaved exceptionally, right? So the entire thing is studied, right? I don't want to say that it's overstudied, because I think that any field which contributes to our understanding of women as violence, whether it's historical or current, is helpful because we know so little about it. But I do think that there's something about the fact that this conflict was in the past, that we can almost try to think that, but women today are not like that anymore. Let's focus on just the positive roles that women are serving in society today, which they are, which we definitely should, but we also should acknowledge women's complexity, rather than sort of put them on this mantle of, either the bad Nazi women or the sort of good heroes of today, who are, saving us from COVID, for example, right? We have a lot of female leaders being praised for that recently. So yes, definitely, I agree. It's understudied. I'm hoping, as for the future studies, I think really interesting material is just coming out on the participation of women in ISIS. And a part of the problem is that it's really hard to get evidence. And part of the problem is that there is a lot of them who are currently stuck in the Al-Hol camp in Syria and have not been repatriated. So we don't actually even have the information from these women who were involved in ISIS, right? So, but I'm thinking that with the case of Hoda Mutana and some of these other women, even though Hoda is still in Syria, and some of these other women, and as we find out more about ISIS, that we will have more studies focusing on more recent conflicts and women's contribution. Just recently, a new article was published on sexual violence and the patterns of sexual violence as caused by ideological, sort of driven through ideological reasons, and sexual violence as ISIS policy, and by Mara Revkin and Elizabeth Wood, that just came out. And so I wonder to what extent there's going to be coverage on sort of how women participated in sexual violence. And definitely there are reports of women who helped or purchased slaves for sexual slavery or child marriage, or right. So we have to remember that, often women participate.
I'm sorry, I think we have a slight. Dr. Steflja, can you hear us? Oh, there we go. You were frozen there for a second.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, all right. I don't know if did you hear the last part about sort of us talking about the sexual violence in ICES?
Yes, and you sort of froze in the part where you said that women often participate, but I think we got the gist of what you were saying.
Okay, okay, wonderful. Let's hope it continues to be stable, the internet connection.
Well, and that actually raises another question, which I think is important to ask as you talk about women's participation at different levels and how that can, can be managed. But what do you think is the significance of holding women accountable for their actions? Because that seems to not happen very often. So if you can speak a little bit.
Definitely. So I think it's important, first of all, because it helps us understand just to what extent women participate in conflict. So it brings visibility to these cases that otherwise are not recognized. And also it helps us sort of reconsider to whether the violence gap between the violence that men commit and violence that women commit is as grand as it appears to be, right? So if we have more people interested in this topic, we can sort of have a better idea rather than continuously just assuming that in every conflict, all women and children are grouped into this category together as the victims. And, policies are made based on these categories. Funding is given based on these categories. The overemphasis of women just as victims is something that we have relied on when it comes to immigration policy, when it comes to aid, development aid, where it goes, right? So sort of trying to understand the complexity of women in conflict also helps us better allocate resources. And so those are sort of policy implications of why this is important. It makes me think of sort of development and the case of Congo, where we've heard of projects where people are sort of looking for, okay, women who are victims of sexual violence, and let's count the numbers and let's just have a high number because that's how we get funding. And sure, this is a really, really important cause. But at the same time, these women may be victims of other type of violence. They also may be perpetrators and victims at the same time. And we're not asking those kinds of questions. When, recently we've found a lot of perpetrators from the conflicts in Rwanda and Bosnia actually in the United States, and they were given asylum, and they also had ended up being, permanent residents, American citizens, without ever knowing that, in fact, they also are perpetrators, right? So just being able to portray women as complex actors who also need to be held accountable, it changes our worldview in general about conflict. And there's another part here that I think is really important, which is if we start thinking about women during conflict as potential perpetrators, I think that even influences how armed groups and national armies are going to potentially behave when in conflict. If a man in one of these armed groups is aware that women can be violent, that they can be guilty of crimes against humanity, torture, right? So the sort of most heinous of crimes. I think that that in some way is also going to make that individual more fearful of the women that they encounter in the battlefield. So in some sense, it also acknowledges that, women can be violent too. They can potentially defend themselves, and they can also be perpetrators. So maybe they won't be just seen as these very easy targets during conflict, sort of an extremely easy way to win war by using women to do so. Because if women are seen as more dangerous, then hopefully in some way that's actually empowering during conflict. I recognize that we have a long way to go here, right? But having some of these cases take place and learning about them and hearing about them, I think is the beginning of changing that perception that women are easy targets in war.
No, I mean, I think that's a great way of thinking about it. So changing the narrative, essentially, is what you're saying, changing the narrative of how we think about women. And we have a couple more questions from the audience. I'm going to go ahead and read them to you. This is a longish one, so I'm going to read the whole thing, and then you can see where you want to go. So the question is, I'm wondering if your research sheds any light, or if you have any insights on women who were complicit in lots of crimes in the Balkans that were never indicted. My thoughts go to the turbo folk star, and I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher her name probably, Svetlana Raznatovic-Saka, her career that is still standing strong, who might be one of the prime examples of this victimhood you were talking about. I'm also wondering what your thoughts are on the potential accountability in the future for this case and others that are still live in the gray area with no significant investigation taking place, yet significant amount of evidence is pointing to their participation or complicity in war crimes and continuing or fueling nationalist ideology.
That is such a great question. And I love that this person brings the example of Svetlana Raznatovic or Tseta. So this woman, just to give you a bit of context, was the wife of Arkan or Željko Raznatovic, who was the biggest paramilitary leader during the Yugoslav conflict. He was not put on trial because he was murdered because the tribunal did not even get the chance to try him because he had too many enemies and sort of too many criminal gangs against him. So he was murdered, assassinated before he could be tried. But he was notorious for example, using his soccer club to recruit young men and sort of using his criminal network to give them, sort of petty economic benefits, which in dire economic circumstances, young men need. But also he was notorious for his criminal network of, and that involved anything from cars and arms to tigers, because his paramilitary group was called Arkan's Tigers, and believe it or not, he actually imported tigers to his mansion. So just to give you an idea of just how much criminal wealth went into this. And so she was his wife, and during the conflict, she had, and even before it, she became extremely popular in the turbo folk nationalist music industry, and she would often be referred to as Mother Serbia, and because of her patriotism, and even though her songs were often extremely romantic and not all of them were patriotic, sort of this was part of this narrative of being the great Serbian wife, and it's really difficult to know just how much of her wealth and accumulation is through his networks, and just to what degree was she involved. Now, that doesn't mean that if people were interested, specifically the Serbian state, that they wouldn't be able to, but they definitely would be able to. But it's true that she continues to be this giant star and sort of helps continue this narrative. Her children also have sort of extreme wealth and these lavish lifestyles that they live, on Instagram as influencers and whatnot. And it's a very sort of vast difference from what the majority of the population experiences on a daily basis. But someone like her who's high profile has not been held accountable. But definitely we have a lot of low profile individuals. Like we start a book with this woman whose name is Zoya, and she was actually one of the women who were the boots on the ground in the former Yugoslav conflict. And she immigrated to the US as a refugee. She ended up getting a regular job. Sort of the news reports suggest how she was a great neighbor. And only later do we find out that she's wanted, that the Bosnian court wants her for war crimes because she participated in the murder of a number of people, right? So I can't imagine, sort of the local courts, the Bosnian courts are working on this, but there's a lot of perpetrators who haven't been accounted for. And, so this is something that is still developing, again, years after the conflict. So that's the one thing about the difficulty of holding people accountable, is that sometimes they're found when they're extremely elderly or when they have passed away, right? So a lot of them fall through the cracks. A lot of men fall through the cracks. So then it's not surprising that if we're not even trying to find the women, because we are assuming that they're all innocent, it's really hard to know how many women actually fall through the cracks.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I have another question for you here. This says, does your research lend itself to policy implications that are relevant to how international organizations like the United Nations should approach ongoing or current conflicts? What should they pay more attention to when attempting peacemaking and peace building in war-torn societies? And thank you for your presentation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. A great question. I think there are so many policy implications here, but I would say, sort of one big implication is that when we look at, let's say, I'm thinking here of the camps in Congo during the Rwandan conflict. It's assumed that if there are men in the camps, that then there's more risk that they would have been involved, right? And that there's really not much information to be found from talking to the women, and that they are just treated all equally, right? So I think that part of this is literally changing the narrative and our worldview of how we approach conflict. And so whether that's policy when it comes to refugee camps, whether that's policy of repatriation, right? So, and I don't necessarily, I'm not making an argument that we shouldn't repatriate women who are in Syria because they may be dangerous. That's not what I'm saying here. I'm saying that, in fact, they probably have a lot of really useful information about ISIS that we are not using by not bringing them back to hold them accountable in whatever way that is, right? Whether that is the legal process or some sort of other transitional justice process. I think that, in that sense, I'm not arguing for a particular sort of legal approach. And I definitely am not suggesting that we need higher sentences for. I don't necessarily believe in higher sentences for men or women, but I do believe in more of an equal treatment. So that if we give certain women the benefits of the doubt, then we should do that with certain men as well, especially if we're talking about, sort of young women are often thought of as more innocent because they made these rash decisions because they're young, right? They're somebody's daughters. But then we don't think about men in that same approach, right? A lot of young men are sort of those who are the most involved in these conflicts. We don't give them the same benefit of the doubt about, whether they were manipulated by somebody, a man or a woman of power. So sort of, policy, I think when I'm talking about policy, it's more in how we go about asking questions and asking these questions, sort of more about mainstreaming approach of thinking about gender in more complex ways than we have so far. We've created this very binary world that it's really hard to get out of. And maybe that means, courts hiring more gender specialists and specialists on those particular contexts where the conflict took place. So, we can't just assume that people who are very good at doing their job, their legal job at carrying out objective proceedings, are going to be necessarily good at understanding the gender dynamics of a conflict. And maybe that requires the involvement of different kinds of actors in those institutions, right? That's sort of what we're implying to when it comes to policy.
Thank you. And there's another next question, also from the audience, that I think will dovetail with what you just discussed, which is, so I'm going to go ahead and ask. It says, I come from the Maldives, and in the last few years, we're seeing a growing influence of ISIS and extremism in our country. However, the patriarchal nature of our justice system actually punishes women and sees women as criminals more so than men in the Maldives. So gender defense before the court seems non-existent. So where can we draw the line between women as perpetrators, but also considering how men are almost never held accountable for their crimes?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for this question. Yes, this is something that's really important that we haven't gotten the chance to talk about as well. So one thing that happens is that we're unable to see women as, that's why I keep saying complex actors, because we see them as black or white. So they're either innocent, and like somebody like Samantha El-Hassani, the American woman who followed her husband from Morocco, and so all of the reports on Samantha El-Hassani are about this, blonde American woman being duped by her husband, portraying her as this really innocent white woman, right? But on the other hand, we have this sort of way of speaking about women who are guilty as monsters and not normal. And so it's a very common stereotype to sort of use them as examples, to make them these exceptional cases, and punish them sometimes much highly than they actually deserve in order to make an example out of them, because women in general are being held to a higher moral standard than men. So then in that sense, for the same crime, it suggested that this woman should have known better than a man, right? So we've sort of accepted that men, ordinary men, are perpetrators, but we have not accepted that ordinary women are perpetrators. So when a woman commits a similar crime, as a man, then we turned her into a monster, right? But that process is the same kind of process of sort of drawing these very black and white images of who women are, rather than willing to think of them as both victims and perpetrators, depending on the context, depending on the situation, depending on their power. So yes, unfortunately, we also see that kind of approach too. Thank you for bringing it up. It's a really important point.
Well, we have about, if anybody else has questions, we have about 10 more minutes, but I wanted to ask you, sort of as we're thinking about all this fascinating information that you're giving us, what do you think we're getting wrong about violent women, especially during armed conflict?
Mm-hmm. I think sort of what we're getting wrong about them is that we are writing, or at least the media, when writing stories about women, but even the academics, we found it really difficult to find reports and analysis that didn't somehow still include extremely gendered information that often was unnecessary. So things such as, things that we see when women are political candidates, the similar kinds of things. So, reference to a war criminal looking in courtroom like somebody's auntie. So sort of explaining that she's wearing a flower dress across, or sort of looking like a teacher. The Pauline Nyiramashuhuko was often referred to as, in courtroom, she looked like a teacher. Well, we know that during the conflict, she put on an army uniform herself, got in the van herself, purposely got Tutsi women into certain locations, telling them that this is where they would be safe, to then order their rape and murder, right? So who cares if she's wearing a flower dress in court? That sort of, so, text is still taken up with these sort of stereotypical ideas or information about their lives that, again, may not really be actually relevant, rather than what are they on trial for, right? Sort of, what is the defense? What did they actually do? When we see the pictures of them, sort of, we have women holding their children, or even in the titles of academic articles. You can't imagine how many we came across that, for example, talked about, again, Pauline especially, as the mother who was a monster. So sort of very dramatic, very sort of, gender, or the mother who ordered rape. Well, we have a lot of fathers who order rape. Why aren't there articles referred to as the father who ordered rape? One thing about Pauline is that she worked together with her son to commit a lot of these crimes. So a lot of the reports on Pauline refer to them as like the mother-son genocidaires, right? And we have a lot of other cases where we have a father-son genocidaire that we never read about. And that sort of, it's just because this person is a woman and a mother that somehow overpowers everything that they did, including their crimes. So there's a bit of a sort of this fascination approach that is still very gendered, that we get very wrong, which we don't apply to men. We don't ask why fathers order heinous crimes. Right? We don't ask why fathers who have daughters and wives, or who are just human beings, may order rape. So sort of, this is still a continuation. And honestly, even writing a book on this, it's really hard to make sure to try not to do the same thing, because it's been so ingrained in how we think about women, and sort of emphasize their family roles. To not do the exact same that we think that we are criticizing. So that's one thing that we really get wrong about writing about women who are violent and who are perpetrators.
I think we have one more question. Yes, but it's probably going to be the last question because we have about 5 minutes left. I said, this person asked, on the flip side, how do we walk the line of holding women accountable and changing the perception of them from being victims as also perpetrators, thus restoring some complexity to our image of women, but also differentiating ourselves from men and women who internalize misogyny, who argue that this would be yet another proof that we are on the same footing, and who ignore gender disparities. Do you think this will be difficult to navigate?
So I don't have an easy answer to this question. And I think that if something kept me up while writing this book, it is this exact question, right? And I think that is what is preventing a lot of people from working on this subject, right? Is sort of assuming that our societies and communities are so patriarchal, and that we are going to simplify things anyways, and that somehow we are incapable of getting to that point of complexity, right? Like I said, I don't have a very good answer, but I don't want to believe that. I guess in that sense, I want to believe that we are capable of, because I think this is required in order to achieve a greater degree of gender equality. I think that we do have to recognize women's capacity to be as violent at times or more violent at times than men in the same positions in order to get closer to gender equality, in order to also, recognize women's power and positive things as well, right? So that it's important for the agency. So, in that sense, I have faith in our ability to think of women as complex actors the way we think of men as complex actors, right? To sort of try and get out of this binary that we've been stuck with for so long. And I think that, in gender and sexuality studies, for example, we are making some progress there where we're getting out of that binary. So why not in conflict and post-conflict studies as well? Maybe we need to be a little more interdisciplinary in how we talk about these issues. And there's a lot to learn from each other there when it comes to gender. So that's sort of what I'd like to end on.
Thank you very, very much. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, and this was scheduled for an hour. So we're pretty much at the end of that hour. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add before we finish up here today, but it was fascinating and great questions. And I think that was all the questions from the audience. Is there anything that you wanted to say just in conclusion before we finish up about your book or about anything we talked about today?
No, I think we've covered quite a bit. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for such interesting and engaging questions. I really appreciate it. And the book has been out. It's Women as War Criminals, and it's myself and my co-author Jessica Trisco Darden. So I appreciate your interest in this work.
Oh, it was. I mean, again, as of yesterday, when you were in my class, I learned a lot today, and I'm very happy that we had the opportunity to host you. And there was some. I think there were some wonderful questions, and I think we all learned a lot about the complexity of gender, and it's something that I think has not received enough attention. So it's wonderful to hear somebody really discuss some of that and you're right, it's so hard not to fall into these gender traps when we think about women in warfare. So it's been fascinating. Well, thank you very much for your time. We're at 1:59, so we're pretty much at the end. I'm assuming that, we scheduled for an hour. I want to be respectful of your time. If you wanted to, stay around and answer some more questions, we can do that, but I'm assuming you probably have places to go to. So thank you very much for your time, and we really appreciate it today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, all.